Hello and welcome to our co-hosted webinar with the Wisconsin Council of Churches and the Carter Center. In case you are confused about the day, it is Tuesday. It is Tuesday afternoon and you are here for part one of a two-part webinar. If you'd like, you could take a moment to introduce yourself and give your location in the chat. We're going to take a few minutes to allow people to arrive. And meanwhile, we'll get ourselves settled and say hello to one another through the chat, which is also where you'll have a chance to leave questions during the presentation. I'm delighted to have with me Nathan Stock from the Carter Center, and we'll get to introductions in just a few minutes. I'm Carrie Parker, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches. So it is a great afternoon here online. Our weather is fabulous wherever it is. It is toasty here on our computer screens. So again, we are here for our webinar. Why are we so divided and what can we do about it? So Nathan Stock with the Carter Center is our presenter. Take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat and we are nearly ready to get started. So if you have not been on a Wisconsin Council of Churches webinar before, I'm delighted to introduce you to Wisconsin Council of Churches space and tell you a little bit more about us. We have been working on civil conversation, healthy public engagement, and faithful work in the public sphere for a number of years. And in the past couple of years, this idea of faith and democracy has become increasingly important to our work. The Wisconsin Council of Churches is a network of 21 Christian traditions and faith-based organizations working together on issues that impact our communities and our houses of worship. Those 21 Christian traditions actually involve 2,000 congregations in the state, in addition to our other partners. Our efforts include ecumenical cooperation, community health, advocacy for the common good and some of the most vulnerable people among us. We aim to model the alternative to destructive voices around us, and we take as our guide values of courage and justice and holy imagination. For the next hour or so, we're going to be in conversation with an expert from the Carter Center. So lots of times we think about the Carter Center as working overseas, but they are working with us domestically as well. The Carter Center was founded by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalynn in 1982 to wage peace, fight disease, and build hope in communities worldwide. It's a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization, and it's worked in more than 80 countries to resolve conflict, advance democracy, protect human rights, prevent disease, and improve mental health care. In the summer of 2020, the center launched a new stream of programming designed to resolve conflicts and strengthen democracy right here in the United States. That being said, we've had the big picture. Now it's my delight to introduce our speaker today. So through the power of networks, we have been introduced to Nathan Stock, who's an associate director with the Carter Center's Conflict Resolution Program. Since summer 2020, Nathan has been leading a new Carter Center project designed to mitigate political and identity-based violence right here in the U.S. He's also a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute. He has 15 years of experience working to reduce violence and strengthen democracy abroad, including nearly a decade working on Middle East conflicts with the Carter Center. He's lived and worked in Afghanistan, Gaza, and China. He holds an MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University and a BA in International Relations from Colgate University. Nathan, it is really good to have you with us today. I'm delighted we have a chance to learn from you, and I want to remind folks that this is only part one of the conversation. And you warned us in the pre-meeting that you're going to leave us with a bit of a cliffhanger today, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not just today. You need to come back next week if you want to get the upswing of the story. So keep your notes. Make sure you've got questions that you post in the chat. I will keep track of them. Our staff will keep track of them, and we will bring them up when we get to the Q&A after about half an hour or so of presentation by Nathan. So, my friend, you are on.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Reverend Parker. Thank you, Reverend Elene and the Wisconsin Council. It is just wonderful to be with you today. So it's become almost cliche to say that Americans are divided, that we're polarized. This afternoon, I want to dive into why this has happened. In particular, I'm going to do three things. First, we're going to look briefly at how our partisan divide has evolved over time. Second, we'll explore the macro level changes in our society that create conditions for polarization, while also considering ways in which our brains may be wired to think and act in tribal groups. And third and finally, we will discuss how this process of polarization is playing out for different communities within the United States. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have plenty of time for discussion. Let me also say that we will make my slides available to you. They're full of quotes, charts, and footnotes. So if you want to read more about this complex topic, you can use these slides as a guide to further resources. So with that, I'd like to share this chart. This is a table from Pew, and it reflects the responses by a variety of Americans to a standard set of questions exploring people's policy preferences. So Pew has been asking these same set of questions to Americans going back to 1994, and the chart ends in 2017. This chart's a little dated, but I'm using it because it is still the best visual representation that I've found for how our partisan divide has grown over time. So the way Americans answered these questions from 94 to 2017 is cross-referenced in this line graph against other demographic factors: their party affiliation, their race, their religious attendance, gender, education, age. And what you can see here is back in 1994, which, at least for me, wasn't that long ago, one's party affiliation was almost no more predictive of one's answers to these questions, these preferences around policy issues and political issues, than one's race or whether or not, say, one attended church. Whereas you fast forward to 2017, and party affiliation was more than twice as predictive of political views of any other demographic characteristic: race, religiousness, etc. To me, this really encapsulates the way in which the partisan divide has really grown in profound ways over a relatively short period of time. So why is this? Well, I'm going to break this part of the discussion up into two parts. So I would argue that first, we have certain structural drivers of polarization. These are macro level, long to medium term trends in our society that structure the world we live in and that make polarization more likely. These are changes in our economy, changes in our demographics, technological changes, changes in the media. All of these have come together over the last few decades to create conditions in which polarization is more likely. So let me break into some of these. The first one that has to be borne in mind is that our democracy is quite unique among democracies. It is, I would say, quirky. And unfortunately, at least in the last couple of decades, those quirks have come together in ways that actually exacerbate polarization. In particular, we are what's called a majoritarian system, right? So our Congress is based on single member districts. You have either a winner or a loser. It's a winner take all system as opposed to a proportional representation system. Our system is also quite rigidly bipartisan. There are two parties. You put all this together and it feeds into a kind of binary division within society. You either have to be a Democrat or you have to be a Republican. It also makes the stakes of a given election quite high. Everything is perceived to be on the line in a given election. You either you win or you lose. The other quirk of our system is we have what political scientists would call strong minoritarian institutions. So we're a majoritarian democracy, and yet we have institutions like the Electoral College, through which a minority party, a party that wins a minority of the vote, say sometimes, can seize the White House, can reach the presidency despite not having won a majority of votes. This is something that also in the 21st century has contributed to polarization. It means that, at least in the last couple of decades, it's been possible for the Republican Party sometimes to win the White House without having to win a majority, which in turn means that there's less incentive on that side of the aisle to run candidates and to promote policies that have broad appeal. When you add that together with gerrymandering, the way our primaries work, there are a lot of structural factors that pull our politics to the margins as opposed to creating incentives for more centrist or moderate candidates. So this is a big one in terms of structural factors, but there's a few others here I want to highlight. Changing demographics, item number 2 on this list. Here I'm just quoting the language of the US Census Bureau. According to the Census Bureau, the foreign-born population of the US in recent years is much higher than it was, say, when I was born. The foreign-born population today is around levels not seen since the early 20th century. And there is a growing mountain of research that suggests that demographic change, immigration, even the fear of potential immigration can have a very disruptive effect on democracies, and not just our democracy, but democracies around the world, fueling sometimes support for authoritarian policies and just generally generating fear. If you want to learn more about that, see the footnote at the bottom. Eric Kaufman's book, White Shift, is a good read. So this is a big one that has to be borne in mind, changing demographics. Third big structural change, closed media ecosystems. I'm sure everybody knows this, right? But first we had the rise of more partisan talk radio, then partisan cable news networks. Now, of course, social media and social media algorithms, which tend to reinforce content that we're already attuned to seeing, right? All of this conspires such that many Americans increasingly live in sort of a closed media loop where we're only exposed to views that reinforce our existing views, and we're not exposed to the views of the other side. This is another, I think, structural factor pushing polarization. Fourth, rising income inequality, and more generally, the way our economy has been working or not working. I don't know if this is the answer to all of our country's challenges, but it's certainly a big one. One resource here, and it's not solely on economics, is Yascha Mounk's book, noted below, The People versus Democracy. One of the points he makes in his book is that from 1935 to 1960, the income of the typical American household doubled. And then from 60 to 1985, it doubled again. This is my grandfather's time, right? My grandfather was a welder. When he got married, he and my grandma lived in a room in a boarding house. And by the time he retired in the 1980s, he owned a home and a couple acres. He had a cottage in Florida and an RV that he traveled around the country in. So, my grandfather, as a product of the 20th century, was someone for whom democracy really delivered. He was a working man for whom democracy had real material benefits in his lived experience. But of course, as I think we all probably know, the economy doesn't work that way anymore, not by a long shot. There's some signs of working class wage growth in the last few years, but by and large, most Americans have been really treading water economically for some decades, even while the cost of housing, healthcare, education, these big fundamentals keeps rising. So this again has to be considered when we think about the forces, dislocating our body politic, pulling apart, generating more extremism in our politics. 5, declining trust in institutions. You can all look this up on the internet. Gallup, polling firm, every year they survey Americans. They ask us, what do we trust? Do we trust banks? Do we trust newspapers, big business, organized religion, the military, the Supreme Court? They've been asking the same battery of questions since the Nixon administration, since the early 70s. And basically, if you look at this data on who and what Americans trust, the line goes like this. So our trust in the institutions of our national life has been declining pretty steadily since before I was born. Why does this matter? Well, if we lose trust in all these other things around us, it's another force that pulls us back into smaller circles, into political tribes or ethnic communities, that leaves the circle of things and people that we trust smaller and smaller, I think in turn contributing to polarization. Finally, number 6, for years now, we have been physically moving around the country to live in homogeneous communities. Here, it's a third footnote on this slide, Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort. He charts how from the mid-70s until he wrote this book in the mid-aughts, how Americans have been moving to live in counties where most people vote like they do. And the metric for his research are presidential election results by county from 1976, that's Carter Ford, through 2004, the Kerry Bush election. And he notes that back in 1976, 38% of Americans lived in a county where one presidential candidate or the other won by a 20-point spread. So according to his book, 20 points is a landslide margin. So that means in 1976, almost 2/3 of Americans lived in counties where the vote margin was small, was under 20 points, right? What does that mean? Well, it means, you're more likely to have lived in a place where other people around you voted differently than you did. Fast forward to 2004, and this is not today, but 2004, and it's reversed. More than 60% of Americans in 2004 lived in counties where either Kerry or Bush won by more than 20 points, won by a landslide. So that's telling us by 2004, a little more than 2/3 of Americans, only approximately a third of Americans, a little less than 2/3, were not living in places where they were likely to encounter people who voted differently from them. Why does that matter? Well, that's not hard to imagine, right? And I'm sure this is something that you've all experienced. We are less likely in the course of our daily lives, at the grocery store or in a house of worship, or maybe even in our workplace, to encounter people who are different from us, which of course feeds, distrust and maybe even dehumanization. So there's a lot that could be said about this. I look forward to discussing all of this with you. You can add or subtract from this list, but these are the big 6 that seem very relevant to me. But before we go on, I want to talk about the way our brains work, because that's another big part of the story. And this quote sums this up for me really well. This is from Jonathan Haidt's work. He's a political psychologist. And he makes this fundamental point, which we should all know, but in my experience, we all have trouble admitting, myself included, is that we're not rational, right? We like to think we just take in data and we coldly analyze the facts, but the science would seem to suggest no human being is capable of that. That's not how we work. We are not rational. We are instead our brains are designed for motivated reasoning. We are wired to prioritize and privilege belonging in our groups, loyalty to our tribe, however we construct that, over some, rational, cold, dispassionate analysis of the facts. We're all like this, regardless of our politics or our background. And I think this quote sums it up well. In particular, there are three things that I would call psychological and behavioral drivers of polarization. So we talked about the structure, we talked about what's changing in American life, but there's also this stuff that's in us, that's in all of our brains, that also lends itself to sort of polarized ways and tribal ways of looking at the world. And the first of these is this idea that I just alluded to, that belonging is more important than facts. And here's another quote that I think sums this up pretty well. This guy is an anthropologist and a psychologist at Washington University, St. Louis. And of course, if you imagine that we all evolved in groups of 30 or so hunter-gatherers, trying not to get eaten by saber-toothed tigers, this makes total sense, right? Because our relationship with our group was a matter of life and death. Your odds of getting eaten by that saber-toothed tiger were a lot higher if you're by yourself, right? So from a safety standpoint, our brains are wired to belong, to need belonging, to need human connection and respect and trust. And so it's not hard to imagine that we would be wired to prioritize fitting into groups, accommodating ourselves to groups, especially over hypothetical things that may not be right in front of us, right? So that's the first of these, what I would call behavioral or psychological drivers. But the second one, and this is super interesting stuff, this again comes from Jonathan Haidt's work, are questions about moral formation. So this guy Haidt writes this great book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's footnoted here. And he does field research. He sets up hypothetical scenarios, stories that he tells people in America, people in Pennsylvania, people in India, people in Brazil. They get the same case studies, the same hypothetical stories. And these stories include moral conundra, moral questions. So-and-so did X. Was it good or bad? Was it immoral or moral? And in running these experiments, asking different populations of people across at least 3 countries, these same sets of hypothetical scenarios, and asking them to evaluate the morality of these different things, he writes this whole book. And he says, you know what? All humans make decisions about morality based on 5 things. And these are listed here, and you can think of them as kind of spectrum of things, continuums, so from one pole to the other. So care and harm is, this is pretty obvious, right? Is someone being hurt or is someone being cared for? Fairness versus cheating, right? Is there some sense of equity? But also loyalty. Are you being loyal to a group? For authority, are you being deferential as appropriate to some authority figure? And then 5, sanctity versus degradation. This gets into questions of purity. Is something clean or unclean? Think for a minute about the many great world religions that spend a lot of time on rules for dividing and demarcating the clean from the unclean. Orthodox Judaism has some of this, Hinduism in particular. So Haidt looks at all this, his research for years, and he comes out arguing that people who lean liberal make decisions about what is right and wrong based on a narrower foundation of moral calculations. People who lean liberal are more focused on numbers 1 and 2 on this list. Is someone being cared for or harmed, and is the scenario thing that's happening fair or unfair? And even if for participants in these studies who skewed more liberal, whether they were from India or America or Brazil, even if the hypothetical story in question seems somehow gross, like they're things that involve gross things. I won't get into too much detail on this call. We can discuss that in the Q&A. The folks who skewed liberal tended to not evaluate things that were gross as being immoral, right? As long as no one was hurt by Action X, they thought, well, it's weird, that's not my bag, but it's moral. Whereas in his target populations in 3 countries, folks who skewed more conservative looked at all 5 of these factors in evaluating whether or not something is moral. So, of course, is someone being hurt or not? And is it sort of equitable? Is it fair? But also, is it clean or unclean? Is there, loyalty to one's superiors or loyalty to one's group? And if you think about this for a minute, it's not hard to imagine if Haidt's research is correct, and I certainly think it is, it's not hard to imagine how these differences in how we determine what is right or wrong shape, in part, our politics. They shape the candidates we vote for. They shape how we think about and view the world. So to me, this is a big one. So just to review, belonging more important than fact, differences in moral formation. But the third one are what I call predispositions and neural polarization. Yeah, wait for that one. Okay, so in addition to all that, I recommend this book by these three political scientists. It's called Predisposed, Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. So these guys are kind of like Haidt, trying to dig into how our brains work and how sometimes automated responses in our brains predict how we respond to the world around us, including different kinds of stimuli, and how that in turn might shape our political preferences. Now, these three guys, they're very careful to argue in their book, which is very worth reading. They're not saying we are born with our politics. They don't say that. They bend over backwards to say that. And this top quote here kind of summarizes that. They say there's some combination of genetics, early childhood experience, and you put it all together and we come up with these distinct response patterns to stimuli. So, for example, here in their research, they cite cases of identical twins who were separated at birth. So let's say you got two twins. One ends up raised in a household that skews kind of liberal in their outlook. One is raised in a household that skews conservative. Time and time again, the politics of the two twins are the same. Whether they were, one was raised in a liberal household or one was raised in a conservative household, they're both one or the other, right? They get into data around what folks who skew left or right are animated by. And they note that folks who skew more liberal tend to respond positively. They get energized by variety of stuff, newness. Whereas folks who skew more conservative tend to have higher threat responses. They tend to be more sensitive to potential threat than folks who skew conservative. And again, this is one of those things where if you think about it for 2 seconds, you can imagine how this maps onto our politics. And, we can talk about this more in the Q&A if you want, but I can certainly think of life experiences where I've been standing next to somebody and we've encountered the exact same situation and had just had radically different responses to it in ways that feel to me as just very ingrained in our biology. So there's this. And then on top of this, now this book was written in 2013, but this research, of course, is continuing. So here I'm quoting a paper from 2020 by some more political scientists who come up with this term neural polarization. So if you just want to get a little more depressed, maybe our neurons are polarized. And I am not a neurologist. I really don't want to get over my skis here, but the basic argument they're making is that a certain region of the brain, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, responds slightly differently in folks who skew left or skew right to the same stimuli. So these guys ran a bunch of experiments where they showed Americans, a cross-section of Americans, videos, 24 videos, short video clips about immigration. They picked immigration because it's an emotive issue. People on the right and the left tend to have strong feelings about it. And they scanned their brains with MRIs as they watched these videos. And sure enough, the DMPFC, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, in these two cohorts lit up in different ways for those who skewed left and skewed right. And as this quote suggests bias processing in the brain that drives how we interpret information, and then would have a bearing on how we are polarized. Okay, so that's a lot. I'm saying there are two big sets of forces conspiring, if you will, to put us in this polarized state. One are these big changes in our country over the last 20 years, and some of it's baked into the hardware of our constitutional order. And then on top of that, arguably, there are other things that may be even baked into the hardware of our brains that also conspire to leave us in this polarized state. Can't talk about that in America, though, without talking for a minute about race. Because one would think, if everything I said was true, if it was as simple as I just laid it out for you, then presumably, if all human beings kind of roughly break down into this sort of liberal conservative spectrum, and we have one party that's more liberal and one party that's more conservative, well, then presumably, all Americans would sort of divide 50-50, and white Americans, but African Americans, other Americans of color, half would vote for the Democrats, half would vote for the Republicans. But we all know that is not the case. Why is that? Well, this quote, I think, sums it up really well. This is by a guy named Theodore Johnson. He was a career naval officer, went on to write some stuff. He's got this really interesting long form article here that's worth reading. And he writes this article to get into this exact question. In the article, he talks about his family and his community and people he knew, other African Americans. And he notes that within his family, there is a wide variety of kind of instinctual political views. He's got an uncle who skews more conservative, his grandma skews more liberal, and that this is just all is normal, right? It's the way all people are. So then he sets out to answer the question, if that is true, why do most African Americans, for the last few decades at least, vote for one party and not the other, right? Why are most African Americans voting Democrat? And in general, it is still true that most voters of color are still, by pretty significant margins, voting for the Democratic Party. Why is that? Well, the argument he's making here is that our political system is, and arguably always has been, profoundly racialized. And so for voters of color, as he quotes here, they're voting on the most important issue for them, which is racial equity, which, for many, at least for the last few decades, has meant voting for the Democratic Party. So where does this leave us? Well, a couple of things. This is from another great book on this subject. This is quoting Liliana Mason, a political scientist. Politics has become our identity. It's no longer just a question of one's political views or party affiliation. It's really kind of an overarching identity that subsumes other things, including race, ethnicity, etc. Or another way of thinking about this that's perhaps even scarier is politics has become our religion. So here, Dr. Mason and others, it's like 10 political scientists got together and wrote this working paper trying to come up with actually a better definition than polarization, a better term to describe like what's going on in America. And the term they landed on was political sectarianism. Now, this doesn't mean that politics is religion. It's not that. What they're saying is that the way, especially partisans, people who are, sort of hard partisans on the left or the right, the way they experience their political affiliation and the relationship to their political opponents feels like a religious conviction, a moral conviction that my side is right and the other side is wrong. It is like, I am good and you are evil. My views are righteous and yours are not. Okay, so that's, I'll admit that's a little bleak. As Reverend Parker said at the outset, tune in next week. This is going to get better. But let me just leave you with one last point, and then we'll open this up for discussion. I also want to talk about, with all of this said, how does this impact sort of the existing social hierarchy, groups within America today? And one thing that research on conflicts around the world makes clear is that, first of all, when societies are undergoing this kind of stress, when political institutions no longer seem to work as the vehicles through which we adjudicate our disputes, then first of all, violence is a possibility. Political violence, identity-based violence, those risks really rise. Those risks are magnified in cases where there was a dominant group that loses power or that fears losing power. So this is a quote from a book by a bunch of European academics. They marshaled a whole bunch of data looking at the onset of civil wars and insurgencies going back to 1946. And what they find is that this particular equation, this particular situation where a dominant group is in charge in a country and gets booted out of power or thinks they might lose power, that elevates your risk for violence. Now, the classic example of this thing they call group status downgrade is Iraq, right? We invaded Iraq in 2003 and we unseated a minority government. The Saddam Hussein regime was largely Sunni Arab Muslims, and Sunni Arabs in Iraq were a minority group. They had been in charge of the country for a long time, but they weren't the majority. We kicked them out of power, and then those same Sunni Arabs became a lot of the backbone of the insurgency that fought both the US forces, but also the new Shiite Muslim Iraqi government. So that's an example of this happening abroad, and there are other such examples, but lest we think that such things can only happen in places like Iraq, there is also a body of research about what's called status threat in America, right? There was a lot of research around the 2016 election, digging into these questions, especially looking at the so-called, swing voters who had voted for Obama and then switched to voting for Trump in 2016. And why did they do that? Was it, economic issues? And I think that the preponderance of the evidence came down on the idea that fundamentally this was about fear that the country was changing, and that, for in a country where I think it's fair to say, white folks, particularly, white Christians have been on top essentially since the beginning, that fear that might be changing, that some Americans might lose that status, drove a lot of the support for, at least in this case, a very, very different Republican candidate and a different set of Republican policies. What I want to leave you with before we get into next week, which is where we're going to talk about what to do with all this, is just the point that this is really normal. I mean, it's not good. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned. But when you think about everything that I've just laid out here, everything that's happening to our country, other cases like this around the world, it's very normal that many Americans would experience the moment we're in as very dislocating, that it would cause people to question institutions, to question the things that, that have always seemed to work in America. So it's not all doom and gloom. We're going to talk more about this next week. And next week, in particular, we'll talk about what you can do in your personal lives, in your community, and in your country to push back against these forces of polarization. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you so much for educating us, even though it was a lot of intense information that is challenging. I'll leave it at challenging. We have words of appreciation coming in the chat. I think we also had some folks during your presentation going, oof. Curiosity, Peter asked, how is it that scientists try to use facts and reason to convince us that facts and reason don't matter? It seems to propose that we're somehow capable of transcending our hardwiring to some degree.
That's a good question, Peter. I think the next logical step in that research in terms of what to do with it, and we'll talk more about this next week, is that there's some wisdom there. There's some good advice there in how you frame your arguments to different audiences, right? There are people who have experimented with how to frame issue advocacy to different target groups. Let's say you want to get a room full of liberals to support increased defense spending, something that, historically folks who lean left might not want to do. What they have found is if you make an equity argument, a fairness, cheating, and equity argument to a more liberal leaning audience, if you say, hey, well, the DoD, the US military, is actually a huge engine for economic equality in the United States. It helps many working class Americans elevate their standard of living. It is in many ways an instrument of redistributing wealth in the country to people who otherwise wouldn't have it. You make that argument that draws on this research and that frames the argument to the thing your target audience wants to hear, a liberal leaning audience that is interested or more attuned to these questions of equity, and you can get them to support your point. You can, if you want to get folks who lean more conservative to embrace, policy change around climate change, then you can make an argument around cleanliness, purity, that, pollution is gross. It makes our rivers gross. Global warming is gross. It's hard. It's killing off animals in a way that's, unsightly and unseemly for our country. And then in turn, those kinds of issue framing devices make those arguments more palatable to people, to communities that might not be open to them. So I think there are ways to leverage this analysis in ways that are constructive.
Thank you. Loretta and Matthew are asking about the perceived loss of power, and asking whether there's an overlap with actual loss in income over time.
That's a really good question. I don't think I can give you an exact answer off the top of my head. What I know is that at least until, say, 2018, I mean, the median income for the average American had been basically flat for decades. So I think for many working class Americans, white and non-white, even if they're not losing money, they can see themselves at best treading water when others in society around them are getting much wealthier. So that's clearly, a long-running trend. And there's a whole body of research that goes back to why does civil war start? That looks into expectations, right? It's not poverty that starts civil wars. It is the perception that you should be better off than you actually are. I grew up about an hour from Buffalo, New York. I grew up in a place where, when I was still a young child, there were a lot of well-paying unionized jobs that you could get with a high school diploma and through which you could achieve the American dream. And those jobs started to dry up when I was 7 years old. And the community that I'm from has never recovered, since the closing of the Bethlehem steel plant in 1984. So, I grew up surrounded by people who could see that they weren't going to achieve the standard of living that their parents had. And that certainly breeds resentment. It certainly breeds, distrust in the political system because it's not delivering.
I think this plays into the question that Lori's asking. If belonging's more important than facts, then folks who might defect would need a plan for a new place to belong. And she's wondering about how challenging that is. That relates to some local conversations they're having at a resource center about how to change hearts and minds.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You'll recall there was some reporting when the COVID vaccines first came out. When the first waves of shots came out, there was reporting about some Americans going to get the shots and not telling people in their community. Mm-hmm. I think this is an example of that phenomenon, right? If you happen to be in a community where people weren't doing that or they look down upon it, there's real costs, social costs, stigma, shame, exclusion from not going with what your group is doing. Which in turn, to your question, means that, if you're going to really, at a more basic level, help folks change views, you need to give them, on-ramps into a new community. There's two ways to do it. One is to give them on-ramps into a new community. Just embrace them and say, hey, come over to our group. You can attend our church and join our political meetings and the whole 9 yards. But the other thing that is worth exploring, and this is really a part of the work I'm trying to do with the Carter Center in several states, is trying to move groups of people so that you don't have the problem of the one individual that stands out, right? So, in the work we were doing in the run up to the 2022 midterms in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, one of the things we did was we promoted this candidate principles for trusted elections. We have these 5 all-American principles that we think that anybody running for office in America ought to be able to support. You can't incite violence. If you lose an election, you can have your day in court. Essentially, eventually, if you lose in court, you got to concede gracefully and do it the American way, right? And we tried to get lots of people from both sides of the aisle, including very prominent candidates, to sign on to these principles. And one of the tactics we used was trying to approach them in groups. Because if you're, one outlier, Republican candidate in a place like Arizona, where there was a pretty robust election skeptic movement, that can be really hard to do, right? But if you could show strength in numbers, if you could show those individuals, hey, I got a whole bunch of county commissioners, they're all on board with this program, and we're going to do it at the same time. You're all going to come out and say on this Tuesday, hey, all these guys signed up to these principles. It gives strength in numbers and a certain amount of cover for people to take controversial decisions.
That seems to really be striking a chord here. And I think that can be really compelling. And I'm wondering where that conversation is going to go in some of our groups. So thank you for bringing that to the table. Rhonda's wondering about what's going to happen when the COVID generation of students becomes voters and how that's going to impact the way that politicians and parties present their narrative. Do you have any insights on that?
Any insights are guesses, but I'll hazard 2 guesses. One is just there's a whole bunch of questions about just the well-being of young Americans today, mental health issues. I mean, I'm sure you all know this, and both the isolation of the pandemic, but then increased use of social media, people being on their phones as opposed to hanging out in groups. I mean, all this stuff. So there's a whole bunch of questions just about how a generation that has experienced these really profound traumas and increased isolation, like what their impact on the political system is going to be. That's a whole open question, and I don't know the answer. I will say, though, that there's I think a fair amount of survey data that suggests that younger Americans quite notably and consistently skew more liberal in their policy preferences. In the traditional sort of left-right axis, they want more government intervention, more support for funding housing, education, healthcare. And that makes sense because if you look, if you just sort of look at age cohorts and wealth and opportunity and economic mobility, in general, the younger you are in this country today, the more challenging your economic prospects are. The more you're coming into a labor market and a housing market that's really very, very hard and much harder than your parents faced or your grandparents. So it's not surprising that younger Americans are supporting, policies that are considered traditionally to be more liberal.
Brianna was wondering about your words of consolation to us a little bit before you got to the end of your presentation when you said, but it's normal. And wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Is there anything that history has taught us about this normal and how we should be approaching this right now, or is that all for next time?
Well, we'll talk more about it next time, but we can talk about it now too. I was on a call the other day with an academic who made this point that being afraid of change, disliking change, is very, very common, especially if you are relatively privileged. If you're in a relatively comfortable position in society, any kind of change might not be welcome. It's just totally normal, right? And if you look at other periods in American history, I mean, you can see somewhat similar patterns to what we're in today, right? The very early 20th century saw a significant spike in political violence, violence from the left, anarchists, militant labor activists setting off bombs in train stations, right? This happened 1906, 7, 8, right? Why? Well, radical changes in the economy, industrialization, huge amounts of immigration, demographic change. It was very disruptive to our political system. We had very high levels of polarization, right? So it's just pretty normal for people to kind of be freaked out when stuff is changing. And the reason, the reason I want to talk about that more, and the reason I gave part one of this two-part program is because we have to understand that to feel grace for our fellow Americans, to not rush to judgment, to orient ourselves toward how do we give a helping hand? How do we hold hands through folks who find the world they're in different from what they knew and find it frightening? I mean, I was in your fair state. I was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and 3-4 weeks ago, we hosted a forum, a meeting with some state election officials and a county clerk to talk about how elections work in Fond du Lac County, and afterwards there was a gentleman who came up to me who had a lot of concerns about the integrity of elections, concerns that there was some kind of widespread fraud, and he said, "We just want things to be the way they were." And I saw nothing but profound and kind sincerity in this man's eyes, and I can't help but feel a certain amount of compassion for that, at least in as much as he's going through these things. He's been exposed to this information that tells him that there's been this terrible fraud with, say, the 2020 election, which, for the record, is not the case. But that's what he's been told, and that's what everybody around him has been told, and it just adds to these fears, right? So, so when you put it all together, it does give me a certain patience, for how hard this is, and perspective for ourselves, as we're all. I mean, if I'm just guessing, if you've made the time to give an hour to this conversation, if you're on this call, you care about these issues, and thank you for that as a start. But it's also worth level setting with just how big this is, like how hard it is to on a systemic level make these changes. We'll talk more about this next week, but next week I'll get into dialogue techniques. Like, how do you dialogue effectively with people who are different? We'll talk about that. But I will also emphasize that alone is not going to do it. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than our individual ability to change minds. We also have to think about some of these bigger structural pieces. That's how I see it.
I think this is immensely helpful framing for prepping us for next week. The reading list alone is worth the price of admission. I say this as a book hound. And even for other parts of the council's work, we have some gems I think that we're going to bring into some of our programming to think about, which I'm really grateful for. So staff members and volunteers, be ready. Friends who are here on today's call, or those of you who are watching the recording, super glad that you could be part of the chat today, part of the learning together today. Pastor Libby is wondering if you're familiar with the book, The Persuaders.
My wife has highly recommended it to me. I really need to read it. I've heard it's great. I confess I have not read it.
Okay. A reminder, the recording is going to come out to you. If you registered for this, it should be coming to your email. If you don't find it, look in your spam. The slides are going to come to you as well. So if you want to be persuading people and educating people, you have an opportunity, because you can share these resources. And come back next week. We're not leaving you at the bottom of the arc. There are resources on their way to continue the conversation and look at ways we can advance connection and not just leave things in the divide. So any last words you want to share today, Nathan?
Uh, just to emphasize that everything I've described here are a result of decisions people made, systems we built, technologies we created. We created all of this, and we can uncreate it. If the research is true, we've always been hardwired for a certain amount of tribal identification and thinking, but we haven't always been this polarized, right? My second slide showed that. We weren't polarized like this in 1994, even though our brains were the same. So I want to leave you on a little bit of a high note, and we're going to talk more about this next week, but we made this and we can unmake it. It will just require a lot of us putting our noses to the grindstone.
There we go. Grace and hope are not bad words to leave on today. So thank you. Watch for the links. And Nathan, we will see you next time around.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good day. Take good care.